Welcome to our panel discussion here on COVID-19 and church finances. My name is Matt Peoples, and in this season, it's been a wild season for the church. And so that's why I wanted to kick things off with a little video that reminds you, even though there's a lot of obstacles around you in ministry, this is also a huge time where the hope you have to give is vitally important. And so, it's easy when we're talking about things like church finances to get so focused in on that we forget the message we carry is vital for the world around us. And so what we want to do today is remember that ministry is going to happen, and we want to help you get strategic and wise about how you can keep that going. But just remember what Jesus said, the birds don't worry about where their food comes from, and how much more important are you in your Heavenly Father's eyes. So that's kind of the tone we're stepping in. I am so excited. I want to introduce you guys to some of our panel. We've got Ben Griffin from LINC. You might recognize him from our last webinar discussion. Ben, how's it going?
Going well. Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
I'm excited for Ben to be here. He's been working with a lot of churches and even doing like some collaborative strategies around finances. So he has some cool stuff to share. And we've got Billy Brath from LCEF, the Lutheran Church Extension Fund.
Yeah.
Billy works with churches around the country on different things like capital campaigns and, getting church finances moving and just creative ideas around church and finances. So we're excited to hear what he has to share. And then, of course, a man that needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyways, Paul Reaves. Paul, how long have you been with LCEF?
This is my 25th year, believe it or not.
Paul works with churches around the country. He works a lot in the Mid-South and the Southern Illinois district. He is an expert when it comes to things like capital campaigns and church finances, and he has seen tons when it comes to that. So I'm really excited for the insights he's going to bring. And then Dave Putman will be joining us. He's having a little trouble with his link. Dave's with the Auxano group, so we're going to help him get plugged in here. But as we dive in today, I just want to start out our conversation with kind of a question. What have you guys noticed about the state that we're in currently, especially when it comes to church finances? And you guys can unmute and dive in.
Is that an open-ended question?
That is an open-ended question right now. We're just going to start with some of the obvious.
Well, I mean, probably the biggest thing is that there's so much unknown that people are just afraid of that. And of course, in the church, we don't want to talk out of both sides of our mouth, but it's easy for us personally, leaders of churches, to kind of do that, we're proclaiming, hey, we got the answer, we got the freedom, virus isn't going to take us down. But then when we go into our meetings, we're looking at the budgets and we're thinking about offerings and of course, thinking the worst. So of course, us in LCEF and certainly why this, Matt, you're doing this today is so that we take our kind of gospel message and bring it to the entire image of the church, and that, we don't worry about finances. Yeah, we do need to do some extra work, and we're going to talk about that today, but we got to remove worry.
I think that's huge. Paul, what are some of the things that you're seeing as we step into this season?
And Matt, we talked a little bit earlier. I've talked to pastors, our principals, our early childhood directors. I've had many conversations, and my heart has really been warmed by the resilience of our people, the creativity, and they just want to find ways to get to the other side when this virus ends. And I think they're doing a terrific job. We want to do everything we can to help them, but it's really warmed my heart to see really the just determination to continue to share God's word with the world, even in the midst of all this confusion.
And so, I think it's huge that you're saying that, because the way we structured this webinar, we're going to hit it all. I know that a lot of you have logged in for really specific reasons. Some of you are wondering, okay, what do we do with our church budget? And I'm on the finance team, and how do I navigate that? Some of you are sitting there going, everybody pays by check. I need to get online. How do I do that? Should I do that? Yes, you should do that. Teaser for later. And then also, there's some of the things we might not be thinking about, like how are we communicating in this time? How are we looking at our community and saying, are there some collaborative things that we could be doing? Are there some outside the box ideas that could actually become very inside the box for us and really helpful for our churches? So we're going to hit a little bit of everything. Let me just tell you up front, there's going to be a ton of information. So a couple of things that you can use during this webinar. We've got a Q&A function. You can ask questions through that. You can monitor the chat. If you see the picture below, that's Susan. She's our communications coordinator for the Auxano Network. She is monitoring the chat. She's monitoring the Q&A and keeping us posted on the questions you have, and we're going to address those. And then also, we're going to drop links in the chat that you can follow. So if we talk about a link to something, you'll be able to find that in the chat. And we're also, after this webinar, going to send out to everybody that registered for the webinar just an overview document that has all the links we're talking about, and especially breakdowns on different church giving platforms that you guys can check out. So to start, let's begin our conversation with communication, because I think in a crisis, you have to communicate. So when you guys think about communication when it comes to the church as a whole, what are some of the most fundamentally important things people need to keep in mind in this season?
Well, all right, I can just kind of start, and that's the power of the phone, to go old school. But some of the churches that we're working with, they kind of jumped on that right away, and it wasn't just the pastor calling, and honestly taking advantage of this kind of unprecedented opportunity we have of the entire church's attention, and they're all sitting at home, not all of them obviously, but most of them. So you can actually call them, and people are going to answer the phone. But beyond that, using video chat, stuff like that. But that personal relationship of pastor to member has just kind of been a cool little nugget in all this. But beyond that, it's just members calling members. And some of our churches that have set up these networks of just constant calling for prayer or for service to connect people that have service ability that can drive around and deliver stuff to folks that aren't able to. But the over communication of just being Christians and in a community with one another has just been massive. And hopefully this, if there's some of you out there that are thinking about doing that, that it expands, and basically all of our churches around the world are just doing this and taking advantage of this time.
Yeah, and I think that's huge what you said, Billy, like doing ministry. I think if we're not careful, we'll become so focused on finances that we forget to do ministry, which is the reason those finances are coming in the first place. So don't allow, thinking about finances to keep you from actually doing ministry and coming up with creative strategies, reaching out to your people, reaching out to your community. I think that's huge. What else do we need to keep in mind when it comes to just communication in general?
Yeah, I got two things to offer. First, you can't over communicate. I mean, people want to hear from you, want to know they're noticed, want to be connected. So that's huge. And secondly is the content of your communication. So when you, or especially a leader, is reaching out to a congregation, your church is going to take an emotional lead from you. So if you're in a place of, hey, yeah, it's all out of control, but I've got faith, and here's why, and here's where we're at as a church, and let me just let you know what's going on. Let me know we got a plan. We're trusting in the Lord, and away we go. People need that. They're looking for that. They resonate with that. And then another piece of messaging that I think is hugely important is the opportunity of this time. There are crises all the time, but this is a shared crisis. Everyone in our neighborhoods are feeling this, everyone in our networks, and we have an opportunity to share the gospel in such a powerful way. So when we communicate with people, I really think it's important that we're also helping equip them with very practical ways that they can be engaged in their community. I know that's not the topic of this talk, we're talking finances, but I do think when we communicate about our hope, we do need to help our people echo that out.
No, but to your point, and Dave's trying to get logged in now. I was talking to Dave Putman earlier, and we were talking about this subject. And to what you're saying, Ben, like, when you have a clear plan and strategy for how you're going to deal with this crisis, not just, hey, here's how we're going to worship, but how are we going to care for our members? How are we going to reach out into our community? What you're going to find is people that want to donate will actually step in and go, you know what? I was waiting for somebody that would have a plan, and I want to support the local church. So how can I support what you're doing right now? So it's not like these things are disconnected. So I think that's a really good point, Ben.
Yeah, I really echo that, Matt. We need to not just speak to our people, but speak to the needs that are happening and draw that path for them. That as you give, this is what our church has been waiting for in some sense, a time of opportunity to connect on the next level. And one thing we did this morning, just my wife and I, we took a whiteboard and we literally just wrote up a question like, how can we be most effective during this time? And then just started writing out a list of thoughts there, both organizationally and individually. It's so helpful.
That's huge. And I think keep those things in mind, guys, because when it comes to communication, realize too, think about the live streams and the Facebook posts and the things you're doing now. Those are going out farther than they ever have before for you probably. And it's because people are desperate for hope. You've got people that are now regularly listening in that weren't really interested before. You've got people sharing your posts that would have never shared them before. So word is starting to get out of the hope you have to bring. And so that's going to be really important in this strategy. Another thing to keep in mind in communication is regular, frequent communication with your staff, with your team leaders. On our team, we started going to a daily Zoom call every morning since we're working remotely. So sometimes it's a longer call if we have more stuff to do. Sometimes it's just a quick 15-minute check-in. What are you doing today? What are you doing? It helps us stay connected as a leadership team. And then also we've planned a call with our elders and our council for earlier before Easter, because everybody's thinking, what are we going to do about Easter? And so we've planned an earlier meeting so that we can say, okay, guys, here's our strategy for Easter. And then here's what we're starting to think about moving forward. So what I would say is you've got the virtual platforms now. Somebody's got Zoom, somebody's got Google Hangouts. Set up those meetings so that you can stay connected with your team, because your team will then help filter that out to the rest of your congregation.
Well, and I'll take this to its logical end is people, of course, are talking about going to a new normal, not to a normal world, just like, post 9/11, et cetera, that we're kind of setting up some of these patterns in the life of Christians. And we'll talk more about this later on in our today, but just this communication protocol of calling again, getting used to hearing from your pastor and from your elders. And we want that to continue. And so these conversations we're having, really start planning for this to continue. Don't, in May or whenever we get released, don't kind of stop some of these patterns. Set it up well now so that your people get used to daily, maybe morning devotions. I'm loving some of the pastors that are doing the evening devotions with their families, and they're just turn on a camera and they're doing it with the families of their church. Little things like that are powerful that, frankly, we probably should have been doing all along. And, the Lord's using this, as he always does, to kind of remind us of the stuff that we could be doing right now.
That's huge. I want to welcome you guys. Probably saw David Putman popping up in the bottom of the screen there. We had some trouble with his link. David is with the Auxano group. He does capital campaigns. He does vision processes for churches. He also runs his own nonprofit, Planting the Gospel, that does some incredible work as well. So Dave, thanks for jumping in. And, you shared something really important on communication as we're closing out this topic, Dave. Can you share with us kind of the importance of communication and the communication plan that we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, I think I can. Let me jump in. Thanks for having me. First of all, what we would say from an Auxano perspective is that what we need to lead in times of uncertainty is clarity. And so while clarity isn't everything, it changes everything. And I think that especially now, so the clearer we can be, the better, Then the second thing that I would say, and I'm sure that somebody's already said it, I think a common mistake that we make in communication is we do broadcast communication. And in reality, we need to learn how to communicate the right information to the right people at the right time. And then probably the last thing I would just say, and then let you guys move on, is, because we're talking about giving, it's so important that at this particular time that we lead with vision, because in our context, what we really believe and what we built all of our generosity work on is the reality that we can't have a financial conversation with someone. We can't have a discipleship conversation with someone without having really clear vision. And so everything starts with vision.
That's huge. That's huge. Well, now I know you did not step into a communications webinar, but it's just vitally linked to finances. But let's dig into.
Yeah, I can't even get on the webinar.
Yeah, Dave can't even get on the webinar.
About communication. And I do this all the time.
I'm calling that user error. I'm calling that user error. So,
oh man,
we're going to dive into now. Let's have a conversation about budgets and economic downturn, because before we talk about bringing money in, we need to figure out how are we preparing for that money that's already there and the money that will come in. So we're all just facing the reality now that we're getting ready for an economic downturn, because as somebody wisely said, even when we get back to work in person, it's still another several weeks after that before people are actually getting into the rhythm, actually getting back in. We're still dealing with all the people that have been laid off now, who are now looking for jobs. And so how do we prepare our churches and our budgets for an economic downturn, or just for the potential of what could happen?
Yeah, this is, of course, LCEF's kind of wheelhouse around the country, as folks are calling us. And not just because of the loan stuff, but because we have relationships with the Paul Reaves of the world, our district vice presidents. And, our first answer is, of course, do not react out of fear. Looking at your expenses, of course, planning for the future is good, right? We should probably always be reanalyzing our budgets. And we can talk tactics in just a moment, but, from our standpoint, and Paul can give you a little more insight, call us at LCEF and let us make sure that we have some systems in place to make sure that you're not worried about things collapsing and you're not worried about budgets falling apart in the next couple months, and instead are taking proactive, positive stuff, but not reacting out of fear of financial hardship. So, Paul.
Matt, certainly one of the things I would encourage churches to do is to begin to run, if they haven't already, different scenarios based on different levels of potential giving. Now, I have a personal philosophy. I don't know if it's going to play out, but I believe, and it's been shown over and over again, this is where the church really shines and our people really shine. I believe that in most churches, we are going to be okay, that people are going to continue to give. We simply have to give them every conceivable avenue in order to continue to support the church. And that's going to be different for different people.
Yeah, we're going to dig. I love that thought. We're definitely going to dig into those avenues next. But you talked about being prepared. How can we do it because we've all planned our budgets. We didn't sit down last year in our fiscal year when we were planning our budget and say, hey guys, hypothetically, we're not going to be able to meet in person for a couple months. Right. So what should our budget do to reflect that? No, everybody's like, this is unprecedented.
Right.
What do we do? So how do you prepare for that in your budgets when you're meeting with your finance people or a finance team?
I just add one thought to that, and there are better experts on this panel I'm looking forward to hear from. But budgets are, in my mind, always secondary to a good set of values. And so really understanding now more than ever, you value will drive what you spend. And so, and I'll just say to the senior leaders out there, if you tell everybody inadvertently what you value is your salary, it's not going to go real well. But if you say, listen, we're putting people first, we're willing to cut wherever we can. And part of that is some of our higher income staff members, including senior pastor, et cetera, we're willing to do whatever we have to balance for a season or the long run to make this work. Those things come out of clear sets of values. And so those derivative pieces down the road, I think, are really secondary to laying out the value. So please also don't neglect engaging your community for survival. And that's also, to me, a value piece.
Well, I think jumping off what you're saying, Ben, have sit down with your own personal budget if you're a senior pastor and say, where are we at? Where's our emergency savings at? What do we need to shift and cut back so that we're ready in case the church needs to make some of these decisions? And then the other thing I did as a senior leader, if you have a staff under you, you need to take time with each of those staff members and just sit down and have a frank conversation with them and ask them, how are your finances? How are you feeling going into this? Assure them that, hey, we're caring for you, we're taking care of you, and we're putting plans in place. But I think your people need that. And then that way you've got a better handle on where it's at, because to Ben's point, yeah, if you're a senior leader, you probably are the one making the most. So then you have a better idea of, okay, how much can I cut back, and who on my staff could afford to cut back the least right now? We've got a young team, but a young team is just starting out. And so they're not the ones that can afford the most right now. So I think that's great. Dave, you've got some really good thoughts on this subject. What are some suggestions you guys are throwing out through Auxano?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I think this is a time that we got to balance faith and wisdom. You know, in other words, we need to be prudent. And I've worked with budgets for years as a pastor, as executive pastor, as denominational leader. And I think sometimes we're notorious in the church for practicing some poor stewardship. And so, you know, these things come along and they sort of correct us. So we have a real opportunity to correct the way we approach our budgeting, which is going to be ultimately a very healthy thing for the church. I think, you know, let's face reality. And I think the reality is, you know, no one knows. We're living in a, you know, mega time of uncertainty. But at the same time, health officials told us this morning that they're looking for this virus to crest in 45 days. You know, economic leaders told us that it'd be another 2 to 3 weeks before people got back to work and the economy jump-started again. And that they anticipate a recession that may be deeper than we would anticipate, 24 to 36 months. And then top it off with a nice little coronavirus cherry, that the coronavirus may be a seasonal kind of virus like the flu. You know, so that's the world that we're moving into. So I think if we're talking church budgets, that you know, we open our eyes and we face reality, and reality is things are changing. You know, as somebody said, they're precipitously falling apart and coming together again at the same time, but they look a lot different when they land. And so I think it gives us the opportunity to address, you know, just a number of things in that end. You know, what I would say, and where I've been trying to really over the last couple of days focus my attention is, you know, I know the first wave of energy goes into what is immediate, you know, and so we're, you know, what is it that we can do to get online, get our money up, offerings coming in, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that in a minute, I think. But where I've been trying to focus, hey, what's going to happen? You know, we've got to look at our budgets and what's going to happen 12, 18 months from now. So I think there's going to be a longer recovery in our churches than we might anticipate. And so I've always practiced a principle in my own life to live under my means. And as a result of that, I don't have a lot of financial stress in my life. Not because I make big money, but because I live on less than I earn. And I think for the church, this is that season where, you know, first of all, like Paul said, we've got to develop some scenarios that sort of project what we might anticipate. You know, we talk about 10, 20, 30% different scenarios, frankly, and I'm an optimist, I think, you know me, Matt, but I'm pretty realistic about this. I think that if I'm leading a church right now, I'm looking at a budget where I'm trying to get down to cutting it about 25, 30% for the next 12, 18 months.
Yeah, I think that's why. And so when Dave talks about 10, 20, 30%, he's talking about just the budget as a whole. But I think if you want to start and see what you have to work with, you could take your offerings income side and subtract 10, 20, 30%. And that would give you a good idea of what you could then expect. And then you could kind of build off that. Some other things you could do, and there's a couple scenarios because Josh Olm posted a great question in here that I want to get to, but let's just say you're in a scenario where budget was making it and you had what we like to call a little bit of fat in the budget, meaning there's some things in there that don't, if they had to go, they could go. And so what you could start doing is you could start looking at some of those things, you know, small to big. Something we did this year is, hey, we're not meeting in person for Easter or Palm Sunday. So when we found out we had the opportunity, we canceled the Palms, we canceled the Easter lilies. It's little things like that. So like stepping through and saying, okay, where do we have fat in the budget? Or another thing that is a good suggestion is, what are some of the things that you've been meaning to do, but you just haven't pulled the trigger on yet? Like a program that wasn't really working before, You know it's not going to be working now. You just haven't pulled the trigger yet on cutting it totally. You know, this is probably the opportunity to step through and cut some of those things back as well. But I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say about this. Josh Ulm said, our congregation just stripped the budget to the bare bones in order to survive. We've been able to do some incredible mission to our community within our means. That being said, what moves would you make in a budget that is already building and pastored?
Call LCEF would be my first answer. And it sounds funny, but when you guys get your the document after this call, you're going to get a link that's going to tell you who your district vice president is. That is, for you, at least, Josh, that's your first call. There's some things we can do to help, especially if you've already done the dramatic cuts. Maybe not yours, because I don't know exactly your situation, Josh, but we have congregations that have dynamic staffs that, you know, some are still running schools, some preschools have closed. And what the pastor has done, or leaders of the church, is they've called every single person that they've either been laid off or furloughed and really had a serious conversation. Do you need this income in order for your family to survive? And so even what you think are essential costs, if you can cut even some paying some of your staff because you have a real conversation with them, but then you find out the people that do require the income in order to survive, that's when you connect the other donors in your church who are financially stable, who are looking to subsidize people directly. And so there's some kind of familial conversations that can happen beyond that. But Josh, if you are just bare bones, that it's not a kidding advice. LCF's here literally for this reason in the middle of the synod.
Yeah, and if you're on and you're not from a Lutheran church, LCEF is Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and they're a financial institution that deals specifically with churches. And so if you're within the Lutheran church, they've got unsecured loans that they're able to offer in this time of emergency. Also, there are other financial institutions that work with churches specifically. And I'm sure Dave and the Auxano group have a list of some of those that they could share with you guys as well.
Yeah, I was just, Matt, about to ask, can we request those funds from the Lutheran group? So appreciate what you guys are doing. Hey, let me add something to this, if you don't mind, because I think it's crucial, and I want to redeem myself a little bit, so you don't think I'm just here to rain on the parade today. But you know, I do think that you've said something very important, and that is that you're getting to do some neat things in the community. And so what I would really encourage you to do is look out there and like I said, just get really intentional about what is God calling us to do in our community at this time. What needs can we meet that no one else can meet? And develop a plan, a very intentional plan. But I would also say that what I'm finding is the churches that are leaning forward into this and that are ministering to the community, many of them that I'm talking with are finding resources to do it. And it's usually coming in the form of some individual that is in a place where they can do more and they're willing to do more. They love what's happening. And so I would really encourage you to look at people in your congregation, if it's one, if it's two, if it's 22, that have the capacity to really make a difference and have one-on-one conversations about reality, about where you're at, about what you're trying to do, what's important to the church, those values that Ben was talking about earlier, and hey, and what's their ROI, what's important to them, what's their return on investment. And so I think this is a time that God has placed people all across the kingdom that are prepared for this, and they're looking for opportunities. So I would go hunting.
That's huge. The other thing I would say, and you're probably catching some of this just even in the way we set up this webinar. You know, this is not just one person giving you all their great advice. We brought a panel together because you can do things better in team when you get wise counsel around you. And so what I'd tell you is, if you have a financial team at your church, meet with that financial team. If you don't have a financial team, and I remember this time in ministry, we were a church plant. We were financially self-sufficient, but we were what I lovingly call college broke. And I didn't yet have a leadership team in place. And so all of a sudden, as the finances were tighter, I felt more and more of that pressure to have to figure it out on my own. The most relieving thing I did, it didn't change a thing in our church budget. It didn't change our income. It didn't change our expenses, is I just created a leadership team. a leadership team that could come around and help me get creative on our budget, on the challenges the church was facing at the time. And the stress level just was removed from my shoulders because I had people that were able to be creative when I couldn't be creative. And so if you're thinking about your financial team, the other thing you need to make sure is on the team of people that are making these decisions in your church, they can't all be paid by the church. Because if finances start to get tight and everybody sitting in that room is dependent on those finances of the church, they're not going to be able to be very creative because they're going to be worried about survival. Get people in the room that don't depend on the finances of the church for their income. Get people in the room that love Jesus but have a deep understanding of finances, and get a variety of people in the room. Because if you get the right people in the room, it's amazing what you're able to do just with what you already have. So that's huge. And then the last thing we would say is we're moving into our next thing, because I know this is what most of you want to kind of dig into and talk about, is be realistic with how long you'll be outside of in-person worship. This is not the time to be like, we're going to be back together on Easter Sunday. The reality is, for most of our country, you're not meeting live on Easter Sunday, probably not for a few weeks after that. And that's okay, but just be realistic about how long it might be, and realize different area of the country, it's going to roll out differently. So I'm sitting up here in New Jersey, right by New York City. We've got 50 to 60% of the current cases. So I'm preparing for the reality that we might not be gathering together as a church until late in the summer or maybe even September. And we're trying to kind of plan for that. So what I would say is come up with those plans for what if we don't meet till summer? What if we don't meet till fall? And kind of have those strategies in place as well, and think through that in your finances. So here's the question everybody wants to know. Income generation. This is probably why 99% of you jumped on this webinar. Part of it was church budget. The rest of it was, how do we get the givers to give? So let's dive into this conversation, guys. How can we start connecting with our givers and making it possible for them to give in this season?
But I just got to say, we've kind of talked about this from lots of different angles, and we've all been pushing into this same center idea. And I know, David, we kind of do the same thing with churches and long-term visioning and basically getting the story together. And then that's basically what capital campaigns are. It's telling the future ministry story. And so when you talk about how to get to your lead givers, how to get to your leaders of your church, people with capacity, or just your regular members, you really got to have that story together. Like, why does your church exist? And David brought up a little bit, what's the purpose of your organization, and what's God leading you to do now into the future in the midst of a crisis, when we're back in the fall, etc. And armed with that, you're reminding your people that you're not a transactional person. Our churches are not transactional. It's not I pay for a sermon. And that's been in the back of our minds, fearful, is if people aren't showing up for worship, they're not paying for worship. But we have to completely throw that out, which we technically did in the Reformation, and come back around to say, we're a group of faithful stewards that God's gathered together to do his work. Currently, we're deployed. We're not having our normal weekly check-in session that we call worship, but we are still a group of people that pool our resources for the purposes of the kingdom. And getting that story, whatever language you use, whatever examples you use, attaching it to the actual core tenets of your church, whatever the main ideas that drive your congregation, promote that, talk about it, lift it up, and remind people that giving is actually an act of stewardship just as much as reaching out to your neighbors, praying for people over the phone, diving into the word like you would normally via the internet or on your own, devotional books, etc. That the life of a Christian continues even if we don't have that gathering in the old school way, because so many churches are doing online versions of gathering, which is pretty neat. So when you think about income generation, instead, think about how are you attaching your people to one another as a group of faithful stewards living out the lives calling them to live. And in the midst of that, now you're changing the conversation. So when you do bring up the realities of money, that we do operate in this world with dollars and not just kind of bringing grain up to the altar like we used to 1,000 years ago, that you have a different platform for it. It's not, hey, our budget's low, give us money. It's here's the work that our congregation's called to do. Here's what the resources are required to do. let's make sure our resources are there to accomplish what God wants us to accomplish. Whole different way of talking about things.
That's huge. So it does begin with that conversation. And what's the story you're telling around giving? I think that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
What else should we be looking at? So, before we move into online giving, what are some ideas that you can implement now if you don't have online platforms and things like that available to get people to give?
Matt, just one of the mechanics that we've put in place, it's kind of old school. And sometimes old school thinking is good thinking. We've got a number of people in our congregations that any type of online or electronic giving, they're very scared and fearful of. You're probably not going to get them to do it. So one suggestion I would have for our churches is go old school and self-address some envelopes back to the church. Put a stamp on those envelopes and send out to every member household a supply of those envelopes with a letter from the pastor that's uplifting, it's encouraging, and it talks about the critical need to continue to support the work of the church because it continues to go on. And that's just one old school way of thinking. And I think you'll be surprised at how many people will find a way to get their offerings to the church.
Yeah, that idea was huge. When Paul first told me that, I immediately emailed my finance team and said, "Hey guys, I have a brilliant idea." And we actually implemented that, and we also used that letter as an opportunity to say, "Hey, we're realizing, like Billy, like you're saying, the story's different," and so we used it as a chance also to catch people up on the story. Hey, here's how you can connect with us in this season. Here's how you can get involved with connection groups now. Here's how you can get spiritual care. Here's some platforms we put in place so that we can connect with you face to face, even when we can't be in the same room. And so we use that letter also as a way to say, hey, we're still here to serve you. This is not just a give me your money letter kind of thing.
Yep. And then don't stop that kind of communication too. In fact, I wrote a letter to my parents for the first time in probably, I don't know, since I was at summer camp when I was a teenager. Just because of this whole oh, wow, I could be writing letters to people because I care about them. Yeah.
That is huge. We've got some great questions coming in from the panel too, as we start to dive into this next round. There was one question I don't want to miss before we get too far. Somebody asked, could you talk about unemployment for church workers if they're laid off? Many churches don't pay into unemployment.
Yes. I'll take a shot at this first, Matt, because I've kind of kept up with the stimulus plan that the federal government has put out. As many of you know, the Senate approved that $2 trillion plus plan this morning. The House still needs to approve it. A lot of smart people, smarter than me, have still got to go through the weeds of that. So I don't have the definitive answer, but it does look as though those who do not pay into the unemployment insurance may be covered in some way under that stimulus plan. So I don't want to give out any false hope, but I would say to everyone, stay tuned on that you might actually be a part of that plan and or what the individual state you live in may be doing.
Yeah, it's covering the gig economy, and that's I think where a lot of our folks are going to fall into, including my roommate here in New York. And so that's something to pay attention to as that rolls out.
That's huge. And then the other question, and I think this one directed to the whole panel, but especially to what you were saying, Billy, how do you get the pastor and the church council to think the way that Billy mentioned?
Oh yeah, Roy. Well, Roy, that is the $1 million question. I think that's partly what Paul, David, and myself get paid to do. Oftentimes is work that process. But the biggest thing is really to remind them that the church is not probably what we settle into thinking it is. Sort of a business, mindset. Now there are of course business practices, and there's good things and right things to do, and wisdom that we would use. But we're not the same. We really are a group of people that God's gathered together. And so reminding your leadership to kind of look at the church once again from above. And this is, of course, another one of these crazy opportunities that God's given us in the midst of this crisis is we can have these intimate conversations about the realities of church, that God looks down on earth and clumps his people together to affect the communities that he's placed them in. And by starting with that basic concept and building off of that, it gives us freedom to rethink about how do we communicate with each other? How do we act as a family, or church community, depending on the language you use? And how do we then work together to affect our communities, even if, again, we're not meeting in brick and mortar situations? Because frankly, there's lots of times we weren't able to meet like we do now. In fact, most of Christendom didn't meet in the exact same ways that we do now. So instead, we're deployed people whom God has gathered together to pool our resources. Now, how does that conversation bring to your leaders? It's probably going to take a few weeks of constant kind of prayer and conversation and probably some study in scripture. But guess what, guys? We got time.
Yeah, and Dave, that brings up a good point, David. We were talking about this earlier, and you brought up a couple good points about just the givers as a whole, because sometimes we lump them all into one category. Like, these are our givers. But you have a much more kind of sophisticated approach to giving, we'll call it. It's simple but sophisticated. You kind of break those categories down. Could you share some of those categories and how we should communicate?
Very sophisticated. Not really. A couple of things. Let me back up a minute and then I'll jump into that. But I want to tag on to what Billy was saying. I think what we believe determines how we behave, how we respond in times like this. And so I love the fact that, this is an opportunity to disciple people like never before. And so I just uploaded the other day an ebook called 1 Hour Theology. You can get it on Amazon, and there's going to be a link, the information you share, I believe, Matt. But it answers 3 questions. What is the gospel? What is a disciple? And what is the church? And in that order, because you sort of have to warm up to get to the answer of church, because it's so misunderstood by people. And so this may just be a great time to disciple people. And whenever we think about giving and raising up givers, we always think of it through the lens of vision, and then number 2, discipleship. So how do we make, and when we talk about a generous or generosity culture, we would say a generosity culture is an intentional discipleship process to raise up generous disciples that continually fund the vision of the church for kingdom impact. And so it all sort of fits together. And so whenever we look at givers, what we recognize is that it is a spiritual process. And so we often plot it on a pathway, and we try to look at, hey, what are the different kind of givers that we have in our church? And just using generic terms, and we have churches that will develop this pathway out. They'll use their language and get creative and really create a pretty cool process or pathway. But from a generic perspective, you've got 4 or 5 groups in your church, however you want to divide it up. But you have non-givers that you have an opportunity to disciple right now. They don't give, they haven't given. You got occasional givers. I find that the largest categories, when I do an analysis of data in churches, the largest group is sort of this occasional giving group that gives less than probably $500 a year. So they'll give 1 or 2 times throughout the year. Thirdly, you got regular givers, but they're not biblical tithers. They're giving $50 a month or a week or $100 a month. And then you have your steadfast tithers, which is, the 20% of our congregation that really makes up 80% of our budget. And then you have those lead givers, So we try to look through the lens of all of those. And by the way, you find those in different places. Have a leadership meeting and talk to your occasional givers would be foolish because they're not there. Really the only place you can get to them is usually, in a better world where we're actually meeting together on a Sunday morning. Now you get to figure out, how do we get to them virtually? And chances are, if you're doing a Sunday morning virtual gathering, some of them are online there, but they're hard to get to outside of a service. So we're constantly looking at how do we take these different types of givers and equip them very intentionally and motivate them even to take the next step of generosity. So that's one of the ways that we approach sort of this discipleship component. And then the last group of givers that when Matt and I were talking earlier, he says, hey, there's another group, and that other group, and I'll let you talk about it, Matt, was not able to give.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we have to be really conscious in this time that, some people are hurting. Some people don't have jobs. Our staff, we've got this restaurant that a bunch of us like to go to, East Coast Burgers. And one of my staff members went down there, and they were talking to the owner, and the owner's like, yep, we're probably gonna have to, close the doors for a little while soon, because my wife just got laid off, and she's the one that holds our health insurance. And I'm not gonna be able to afford to pay the employees, to keep the doors open, because, business has slowed down quite a bit. And so I think we need to recognize that those aren't just stories in our community. Those are stories of some of our people. And we can't be one-sided when we're looking at giving. I think we do need to reach out to our congregation and say, hey, we know that this is hitting. Has anybody lost a job? If there's any needs, would you call us up? Would you let us have a conversation? Would you let us be in prayer for you? Would you let us help you get connected to some resources? I think the more we care about people, whether or not they can give, the more we show people when they do give, the reason they are giving. And so keep that category in mind. And when you're messaging your giving, don't make somebody feel guilty because they're in a season where God hasn't provided yet. Because remember, that's why the tithe was always a percentage. It was of what God has given you, you can give. And so I just kind of encourage people that.
It's sort of the old school idea that not equal gifts, but equal sacrifice. And I think we can celebrate and help people feel value that have absolutely, there's no such thing as nothing to give. They have something to give. We've just got to figure it out. And so that, that's our challenge is how do we include everyone in this process and make it a discipleship process.
Yeah. So David, on that, I just got a memo from one of our district vice presidents, Pastor David Thiel, and some letter that's going around in his districts, referencing chapter 2 of Acts, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings, etc. And you can read that through verse 47. But the concept he's drawing out of that, of course, is that the actions of these new believers cause a sense of favor to permeate through the community. So as these new believers are coming on board and getting excited about giving of themselves, of course, giving of dollars too, that was permeating. And so as we start sharing stories of people serving in the great, in our congregations, of course, but through Christendom in general, sharing these stories of service and of love and of giving. And so we want to encourage, actually, David, all those sections of people talking about the widows' mites that are coming in, talking about people pooling their resources. A question here about people that are working that are going to get a government check, which, I'm going to take the government check and do something with it, to one of my ministries here in New York. And so there's all these things that we're able to storytell, and let's let Acts chapter 2 do what it's done throughout the generations and reboot a lot of our generosity in churches.
Absolutely. And I'll
Thanks,
say
David,
one more thing related to it. So like Sunday, of course, I'm like everyone else. I'm sitting in my living room with my wife and we're watching church online. And when the pastor got through, we sat there and we had a deep dialogue. And the question we were trying to answer, what is our personal, as a family, what is our family response to what we're facing right now? And I won't go through it to take up the time, but I came up with 5 different things. And the last one was to share what we have. And our commitment that morning, was, hey, this is not a time to save. This is not a time to spend, but this is a time to take what we have and share it with other people. And so, that becomes real practical for us. I've got a son and daughter who both are not working right now because of this, just happened, and I may, but I've already determined that just like our Heavenly Father cares for us, I'm going to care for them. And there are other people in my community and in my church, and the rule applies for everything. But imagine our congregation, if we, through our teaching and preaching and discipling of people, if we can help people intentionally make a decision about how they're going to respond And once you get to the point where you give it up, then the rest of it is all about, the rest of it's easy. The ask is easy when people are sitting there with their hands open saying, hey, okay, I'm going to share what I have, because that's what that's what we do.
And I think the last couple old school methods that you guys have all shared, I'm going to kind of summarize are, this discipleship process of teaching givers is not going to happen through one letter blast, one video blast. It's going to happen through one-on-one conversations, small group conversations. So set up a strategy where you're having those conversations. And that doesn't involve you setting up any different giving platforms. It's just kind of back to what we said. Maybe it's just you picking up a phone and reaching out and just seeing how people are doing, and then letting them know what some of the needs might be and how they can directly support one another, or how they could support through the church. Now, we're going to dive into the thing that I know is on everybody's hearts and minds: online giving. This is something I've been super passionate about, and I think we're getting a lot more interest in because of the obvious fact that people aren't in person. And I think too, realizing you're a church, you're in a really unique time in history, not just because of what's going on with COVID-19, but because the way people give is so varied and radically different. Some of your older members have given by check since they got a checkbook. I remember learning how to use a checkbook. I know we have one in our house. I'm pretty sure what drawer it's in. And I think in the last couple of years, I've literally written 2 checks. Everything I do financially is online. I rarely carry cash unless I'm going to the pizza place down the street that refuses to take my card. And so if we're, as the church, not set up for online giving, we're missing out. But can the panel speak to one of the biggest things that stands in people's way of setting up online giving: the fees?
Fear. Oh, the fees? Wait, you say fear
and fees, but let's speak to the fees.
Well, this is where LCEF can help a little bit. Paul, I think you know the details.
Yeah. Let me speak to it just real quickly for our Lutheran folks out there. LCEF has this tool called Joyful Response. The great thing about Joyful Response is there are no fees, either to the person giving or to the church. Now, it only accepts at this point the ACH. We're not getting into credit cards at that point. You can through Joyful Response, then there is a fee to the church. But if you only do the online giving with the ACH, there's no fee involved. And I would encourage you, I would urge you to contact your district vice president or the LCEF national office so that we can get you started. It'll take about a week to go through the process and get you up and running, but it's critical at this time that you really look at that online giving option.
Paul, that's awesome. I love that. Once again, I'm giving me more and more reasons to jump ship and head over. Love your tribe, work with them a whole lot. So just another reason. But hey, another resource, if you're not part of the tribe here, is Generosity by Lifeway. They have Todd McMitchin is actually a good friend of mine who leads that area, and a mentor of mine in the area of generosity. Really bright guy. You should follow him, especially during this time. But they're giving their platform away free, so all the sign up, the things that you normally pay for are not being charged. But there is a charge per transaction that you'll find, like you were discussing, Paul, outside of that one if you're using a credit card, you're going to get, in most cases. But that's the only charge. And I know that they onboarded 800 churches last week. So they're going gangbusters. That'd be another resource. Not going to compete. I mean, use your in-house service that's been made available through your denomination. But if you don't have a denomination, and then Lifeway is associated with Baptists, so if you're Baptist and want to look up there, that's a good place to go. And
here's a couple thoughts on the online side, so you guys can kind of think this through well. I worked with some small businesses when we were at the Point, and we would do these kind of community impact things. And I learned a really valuable lesson from the small business. It's called the cost of doing business. Mm-hmm. And the reality is this. Yeah, maybe you have a credit card processing fee, and say that means you're only going to get 98% of the gift that's given. 98% of something is more than 100% of nothing. And oftentimes you're allowing the cost of doing business to stand in the way of actually being able to do business, i.e. being able to take in these kind of online offerings. And so it's really important, because if you want to reach, a lot of churches want to reach younger people. Guess what? If you want to reach younger people and you want to disciple younger people, you have to give them these same opportunities to give. And our household finances, we do everything online. And in fact, it's actually easier to do it online. A lot of these online platforms will give you the option to do reoccurring gifts. So essentially it can operate like your mortgage payment. It can just sit in the background and just constantly be going into the church. So people are giving, they're being good stewards. They're not having to think about it too much. But they've already made that decision. Hey, the church is in my finances, and I've got a reoccurring gift to help with that. Something we're doing to help you guys out, because I know it's crazy if you're trying to set up online giving right now, and it's a little bit overwhelming, is we've created a spreadsheet that has different online giving platforms, some that we've used, some that we are connected with. It's got some of their fees listed. It also has some of the, existing like rebates they're giving you. For example, a lot of places are going 3 months, 6 months free on their premium service. And so kind of keep that in mind. And then the other thing to keep in mind is there'll always be, if you're doing credit card and debit card, a processing fee. And that's not coming from the platform. That's the fee they have to use to be able to take credit cards. So they can't control that. So if you call them up and you're like, hey, waive that fee, they'll be like, love to, we can't. The other fee that you usually see on top of that is so that they can maintain their platform. And everybody's going to take that fee in a different way. Some people are going to charge it to every gift. Some people are going to charge you a monthly fee for using their giving platform. Some people will say, hey, we don't charge that extra fee on top, but they're just saying, but you have a monthly fee. Just evaluate what's best for you and your church in that season. And then the other thing you can do is keep in mind when you're doing online giving, the easier it is to click to the gift, the more likely it is you'll get the gift. So if I have to take 2 or 3 extra clicks, or I have to set up a login, that's going to make it less likely for me to give that gift versus if all that stuff is integrated naturally into the giving process. And so the last thing you can do with that to make it even easier is set up a unique giving URL for your church. And the reason I say set up a unique giving URL, something we started as soon as this started, is for Bethlehem, we have supportbethlehem.church. Supportbethlehem.church. And so what I'm able to do is I've created a unique URL that anybody can get into from their smartphone, from their mobile web browser. If they're sitting there in church, if they're sitting there on the live stream, I just say, hey, if you want to support us, go to supportbethlehem.church. And they'll jump onto that. It'll pull up our online giving. It takes them right to the spot where it's the fewest clicks to give. And it just makes it easier across the board for us to share that information. And then you're able to kind of integrate your whole giving plan through that. So those are a couple things for the online giving side.
And Matt, there's going to be kind of 2 ministry sides of this. The good side of it is that it reminds people that, regular giving, pooling your resources is what's happening there. You're not paying for worship, which sometimes is what the offering plate going around can put into our brains. But the other side of this that I always get with congregations is I like putting something in the offering plate. I don't want to be embarrassed by not putting something in the offering plate, or I want to teach my kids to give. And so I want to give. And I remember when I worship with my parents, they hand me $1. I'm 38 years old. So there's a few answers and there's a spectrum here. Some churches have stopped passing the offering plate. So that is of course an extreme. And there's certain more kind of new congregations that are just built that way. Kind of the middle ground is that there's other things you can put in the offering plate. Sometimes they give electronically. Other people, like my first congregation, our prayer cards and our attendance cards went into the offering plate. So you're putting something in there. But the other, and then we can get around all those. The educating your kids, I think, is the actual quality argument here. I learned about giving by my parents with the offering plate. But kids are not like me when I was a little kid. Help with your kids, set this up online. Let them see what you're doing. Let them participate in understanding online giving. They're complete natives to technology. So don't be afraid to still show them that you're participating in giving to your congregation. It's just not doing it the same way as we were all taught.
Yeah, and then on the plus end, they may do what they do with Amazon and accidentally give a gift later for you, which would be a really good thing for the church, right? No, I think that's a great thought. So I think, you know, there's a lot we could dive into there. Definitely check out the resource we're sending out on that. But the other piece we want to get to here as we're digging into this conversation is impacting your community. I think if we're so focused on just our church and our church's finances, we're going to miss the bigger kingdom of God questions and opportunities that God's giving us. And God says, when he's talking about finances, seek first the kingdom. So what can we be doing in this broader financial strategy to make sure that we're not just setting things up to make sure that we're keeping our business going, but how can we be a part of that bigger impact going on? Ben, you've got some amazing things to share on this.
Yeah, I have a host of ideas ranging from churches collaborating efforts together, both financially and missionally. So, but more directly to your question, which is how do you reach your community in this specific area? One of the things that we're working on in the Twin Cities right now, which is where I'm at, is collaborating the efforts of churches. We're all experiencing this. We're all experiencing the same thing. And on the back end of this, we're going to be asked by so many people for help all over the place. Our communities are all hurting. So how do we collaborate our efforts so they're more efficient and effective? And some really fun conversations are happening right now around that. But I would just say it is a huge opportunity for the church to be the church. Because what's going to happen is the same people are going to be coming to 5 churches in a community. How do we coordinate to best reach them? How do we set up every church in a city to be a hub that people go to for answers when they're struggling with this? Like, I'm kind of getting tired of hearing about millionaire celebrities who are given $1 million to this and $1 million to that. I'm not saying the church needs to be on the news, but frankly, we should be making waves because we are stepping up and being the church. And so right now, we brought together, and I think any one of us can do this in our sphere of influence, but we've brought together influencers in the Twin Cities. We've actually just secured earlier today, Minnesota MN Acts2.church, the website, so that we can create a hub by which we can equip local churches to be a hub for their community. And we can share our financial resources to create a bigger wave of impact in responding to the needs. And there's a lot more detail to that. And I've got all sorts of other things here. I don't want to just go down my list. Certainly want to let other people roll, but on how churches can work together. I mean, think about our back end support. So much of the way we do our finances is actually duplicative. And so like LINC, one of the things we're doing is refining some of our back end support so we can share it with other organizations. And in so doing, we all do it cheaper. And is there a way that we can do some of that to be more effective? We have incredible spaces that our churches are in. And right now there's going to be people hurting for space, businesses hurting for office space. This could be an incredible time to open up our facilities and say, listen, we will give you a deal compared to what you had before. And we actually start inviting in community groups using our space in ways that we've never seen before. Even if hospitals are getting overrun, we got a lot of empty churches people could start getting involved in. Volunteer coordination across citywide efforts. So I'm an idea overthinker. I've got a few of them, but we're really working to build a system for deployment right now on these things, not just thinking about, but really activating those in our specific network.
Well, and that's a huge idea, especially if you guys are struggling to get online. If there's a few churches that are maybe a little bit smaller in size, you could gather together. This is what we do with our church plants in our district, is all the church plants are on the same online giving platform. They all have unique giving URLs to help with that. And so it decreases the amount of fees they pay, especially if they're on like a monthly based kind of system. And so you could do that with a group of churches. If there's a group of churches that need to get online giving going, you could come together as one and then easily designate those funds to the right spot, and be able to kind of jump into it that way and miss some of those fees as well.
Yeah, and one other thing that I'd like to share, and it's a little bit out of left field, speaks to what we were talking about before, and there are heroes in all of our churches, just those people who are stepping up right now. And I think it does great service to our church and our mission to just tell those stories. Like this guy, Paul, messaged me yesterday and he goes, listen, I want you to know we're tightening our personal belt, and we're shoring up our finances so that we're ready to respond to the need that we know is coming. I mean, how encouraging is that to hear? And then go and tell other people, hey, did you see what Paul is doing? Let's just celebrate that. And because of that, other people go, wait, I should be doing that too. I mean, it creates an inspiration for all of us.
That's huge. Yeah, don't neglect sharing the stories, because they'll make an impact on your church and your community as well. Man, this is obviously we've been sharing just a fire hose of information for you guys. And this is the goal of this webinar, was to help get you started, to help you kind of think through some of those things. So as we're closing out this time, from the panel, is there anything that you feel like we need to mention that maybe we haven't already mentioned, or highlight that maybe we haven't already highlighted before we close out our time together?
I want to say something that you guys have probably noticed. I know nothing. I'm just kind of taking stuff around our denomination and pumping it through this online webinar. And one of the many churches I watched this weekend was Trinity Lyle, and Pastor Mark Schultz up there this weekend. And he sort of said something that all of us kind of know but never say, is that great question, God, what are you up to? And now we should do this every day, every moment. But in this time, when society's in fear and some of us are scrambling around, he really encouraged and said, guys, pause. God, what are you up to in the midst of all this? And answering that question ends up making this just, frankly, a blast. Because when else have we had this time where we have technology and information and the ability to connect with people and a message of hope and joy and long-term plans? Because we know this isn't going to, the end of the world could come anytime, but it's not because of a virus. So we know the world's going to continue. We know the kingdom is going to continue. And so let's take advantage of this ridiculously awesome opportunity to connect with people, to rethink why we exist as congregations, and get back out there safely as we can and do the work God's calling us to. God, what are you up to during this time?
That's huge. That's huge. Fellas, I can't thank you enough for your time. Everybody, if you're watching this webinar, if you want to connect with any of our panelists, we'll have all their emails that we'll blast out to you. They've got some great resources. Billy and Paul have some amazing resources through LCEF that they can help you with. I'd encourage you, reach out to them, reach out to your LCEF VP. Ben has got some amazing resources. We had some questions about immigrant churches pop in. Ben, that is his wheelhouse. That's literally what LINC works with. So if you're struggling with how do we get this stuff going for some of our immigrant churches, Ben is a great guy to ask. And Dave has done some amazing work with a CPR, a Corona plan of action for your church. And so if you want to learn how you can put some of those things together, reach out to Dave. We're going to add those links in there as well. And then, of course, we've got past webinars you can check out. We're trying to do these webinars roughly once a week to help you guys out with different issues you're facing. And so if there's anything we can do, please reach out. Let us know. You can go to www.lifeofachurchplanter.com. That's www.lifeofachurchplanter.com. You can find more webinars, past webinars we've done that are all available on demand. And if this has been helpful for you and you want to create that conversation with your financial team, you can take the link that you used to sign up and we'll send you another link back out, and you can share that out with your team and they can watch this entire webinar as well on demand. So till next time, guys, thank you so much for being a part of this and for sharing your time and your resources.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
See you guys.